All right. Well, thank you for coming in for this last session late in the day. Nice to see plenty of people. And I hope we've got an interesting session coming up. I think it's quite miscellaneous in a way, but I'm sure we'll find ways of making connections, because there have been connections between almost everything that has been talked about here. And the first speaker is Stella Palekarova from the University of Toronto, and she is going to be talking about the Informational Body, a socio-medical theory of disability and the ethics of the brain-machine interface.
Thank you very much. Also, good afternoon. I'm joining you late in this conference, but I had a long journey here from Toronto. So while I have a diverse background spanning psychology, the fine arts, and most recently a Master's of Information, what seems to have always linked my interest has been the idea or the goal of trying to improve the quality of life or the conditions for people with disabilities. And specifically people with physical disabilities, because this is the lived experience that I'm obviously most familiar with. My research on the brain-machine interface, also known by some as the brain-computer interface, grew out of a really long-time love and fascination with science fiction. The works of Isaac Asimov, Philip K. Dick, obviously, cyberpunk of William Gibson, and really imagining the impact that robotics, cybernetics, and artificial intelligence would have on our future. So for many of us, thinking of a cyborg conjures up characters like Seven of Nine in Star Trek. Do you guys get Star Trek here? Yeah? So the Borg, my picture of the Borg didn't show up on the screen. There was a picture of Seven of Nine. Anyways, so this idea of an unnatural imposition of machine parts into our human biology, the development of a grotesque superhuman being. For me, the cyborgs always pose an exciting possibility, though, for transfiguring or transgressing my own otherness as a person with a disability. The integration of the machine or computer parts in the human biology is sort of a gateway of opening up the range of our potentiality as human beings, being able to do things autonomously that we may not otherwise be able to do, and having access to opportunities and information that we may not otherwise have access. But in merely imagining these possibilities, I found myself at odds with the very discourse that helped shape or define disability identity and unite our experiences of oppression under a common umbrella. Oh, there's the picture. So before getting into the ideological discord that got me thinking about how we quantify or measure quality of life and how cybernetic technologies play into that for people with disabilities, let's break down the basics of how a BMI or brain-machine interface works. So the brain-machine interface establishes a direct communication pathway between the brain and an external device, a lot of times a computer or prosthetics, that sort of thing. And it was initially aimed at augmenting or repairing human cognitive and sensory functions. The first real strides were made in the 1990s, I would say. There are two types of BMI. One is non-invasive and the other is invasive. So non-invasive BMIs are wearable, and we're getting a lot of that now with integration into Apple devices, things that help us regulate biofeedback signals, to meditate and show us our heart rate, and things like that. And also with gaming systems like the Epoch gaming system, which lets you use eye tracking to control a cursor. The first successful use has enabled people with ALS to learn to control computer spelling in order to communicate. And another experiment enabled a tetraplegic patient to grasp objects with a paralyzed hand. Invasive BMIs have really taken off over the last, I would say, 10 years, although they're still highly experimental. For the technology, though, to be fully effective, the brain has to undergo experienced dependent plasticity. So it starts to recognize an external component like an arm, a bionic arm or something like that as part of its own, as part of the physiology. So one of the drawbacks to this type of technology is that once it's implanted, it's difficult to extract. Other examples of this would be like the cochlear ear implant and cortical chips that help us process vision. So, while it seems obvious that such technologies, if implemented and accessible to people with disabilities, have the potential to greatly improve quality of life, there's considerable debate within disability studies and culture around where such technologies sit on the spectrum of medical and social interventions. To understand the controversy, we have to really appreciate the history of disabled resistance through which the social model of disabilities emerged in the 80s. Some of you are probably aware of Thomas Shakespeare's work from the United Kingdom, and it told us that disability wasn't a function of physical deficit or impairment, but rather the symptom of a society that fails to accommodate differences and adapt to bodies that are outside of this realm of normal or normative operation. This is in direct contrast to the medical model of disability, which up until that point focused on the individual or on disability as something to be fixed and cured, rather than valued as a lived experience. While these are disparate and polar opposite treatments of disability, both have been contested. Over the last decade or so, especially, there's a great deal of resistance among disability scholars and people who identify as disabled to curative medical interventions. What most scholars, though, agree on is that disability and impairment affect a person's quality of life. So whether you perceive disablement as inherent to disability or environment. But how do we quantify or measure quality of life is the real question. The answer seems in many respects to lie with our relationship to understanding absences and deficiencies. So the affirmation model, which is one that's sort of recently come out to contest both the medical and social models, was introduced in the early 2000s by Swain and French, and it posited that it isn't disability itself that causes unhappiness, but rather disabling expectations of independence, normalization, adjustment, and acceptance to life with a disability. Put another way, we interpret our quality of life based on how we perceive our ability to function, be valued, and contribute to society. And it's this perception that forms through an observation or comparison of what we see around us or who we see around us functioning in the environment. Of course, this idea emerges directly from Foucault's socio-semiotic interactionist theory of meaning-making, whereby the body is the site of both communication and signification, inter the self and between self and others. So this understanding formed the basis of my argument and the core of my study. So I set out to demonstrate the emancipatory potential that BMIs have for people with disabilities, but that the research and development and access to these technologies is constrained not only logistically, but ideologically. I felt that the BMI could be a focal point for recognizing a mutually dependent relationship between the medical and social models of disability, or a stepping stone to introducing what I call a socio-medical model. The BMI is categorically a boundary object, which Bacher and Starr talk a lot about in information theory. It's a technology that does not threaten to efface the category of disability, I feel, but may rather allow people with disabilities to inhabit multiple contexts of identity. or to encompass local and shared meanings across communities of representation. In other words, it's possible to identify as a person with a disability and still have the ability to function more autonomously, pursue interests and activities through an augmentation of communication and information pathways. This model would have to be enacted through a new body heuristic that I call the Informational Body heuristic. And we'll talk more about that. I further propose that there are ways to legitimize who receives this kind of technology or treatment, if you prefer. So, transhumanism advocates for integrating technology and human biology in order to achieve the survival and the full potential of every individual. This is one of the ways of looking at the ideology behind this. And of course, most notable writers in this field are Haraway, Hales, and Huxley. Transhumanists regard biotechnological modification as a positive evolutionary outgrowth, and they argue that actually not using technology is de-evolutionary and irresponsible in many ways. In contrast, critical disability studies discourses both directly and indirectly criticize biotechnological modification as a scientific imposition of control and a product of unrealistic standards of normalcy over everyone who is different in some ways from the status quo. Even if the case can be made, though, that the BMI technologies straddle the medical and the social approaches toward disability, it's difficult to ignore the question of whether such technologies can be distinguished as a treatment or an enhancement. So at what point do we say that something is now transgressing what is normal for a human to be able to accomplish? Some theorists argue that such technologies threaten to alter our essential human nature and to efface conditions of hardship that shape our compassion, courage, and resilience. But it seems rather absurd to me to place the onus of those with disabilities and illnesses for the relative humanness of the rest of us. In fact, prosthesis, wheelchairs, and computers have already formed us into hybrids or cyborgs, as Haraway has said. I've argued that living in a state of dependency and surveillance can actually lead to a state of psychological self-perpetuating state of learned helplessness. Perceiving that you have little control over your current state of being and your environment. So that leads to a range of possibilities to be very limited for people with disabilities. Looking at the heuristics of the body, I couldn't find any one framework that directly addressed the issue of quality of life for people with disabilities vis-a-vis technology. It seemed to me more and more thinking about disability as an absence of physical function is actually short-sighted. The outcome of just about any disabling condition is the impact on the individual to have effects or to autonomously be able to function in your own physical environment and within your own body, and how this impacts the range of your own, to be able to fulfill your potentials. So drawing on cybernetics and the genetic model, I envisaged the informational body heuristic that examines the degree to which we're able to process information intra-self and outside of ourselves. Adaptive devices like the BMI carry intentional information akin to how we can think of the genetic code, and are disintermediary devices that patch an informational system. So in this way, they really do straddle both the medical and social realm of disability. Now, in order to better support my arguments on this new heuristic, I took to exploratory qualitative research. Based on my bachelor's thesis on exploring the dating experiences of young women with congenital disabilities, I actually hypothesized that people with acquired disabilities would be more receptive to these kinds of interventions than people with congenital disabilities. And along these lines, that the age of onset would also have an impact. Further, I wanted to probe how the BMIs were being framed by the very researchers developing these technologies. Was there something inherent in the way the technologies were developed and presented to people that would impact perceptions of them? These questions led to further inquiry about how any disparate understandings of BMI technologies could be bridged and what ethical protocol or policy would be needed in order to equitably disseminate the technology. I used a hermeneutic phenomenological approach, which facilitates an understanding of how we formulate meaning around lived realities and helps us to interpret experiences related to us that we can see, so that we can see their impact on individuals and society. This approach allows us to acknowledge our own researcher biases, which clearly I have researcher bias in this area, and in a reflexive way, and it allows us to come at the research as not unbiased, but aware of our own biases and able to address that in the study. So using a set of semi-structured interview questions, I interviewed 12 participants with congenital disabilities and 10 with acquired. And I also interviewed 5 researchers working in this field in Canada and the US. Broadly, my theme centered around perceptions of disability, disability culture as a community of shared history and experience and representation, and of biotechnological enhancements like the brain-machine interface. So, if the ontology of disability, it really is shaped by common language and culture, then how we come to belong to it would be irrelevant. Yet participants with congenital disabilities, despite varied views on disability, felt a much stronger affiliation with disability culture in general. They were more unified in describing this community. The views of how the community manifests ranged from shared stigmas, barriers, and the lived experiences of oppression to the uniqueness of our situation, as one participant said, to people coming together to discuss issues around disability with its own language and customs, to celebrating disability and fighting for limited resources. Another respondent commented that people with disabilities have tried to be a community for a long time, like the TBL gay community or other ethnic alliances, but that disability culture is very divided and has different needs based on niche cultures, like the deaf community or visually impaired individuals. As pointed out by Peters, some disabled people live in abject poverty, and issues of culture take a backseat to economic survival. So culture in some way is has been constructed by the academic discourses, and it's not freely or readily available to everybody. When probed about how disability affected lifestyle and quality of life, an overwhelming majority of respondents with congenital disabilities focused a great deal on issues related to attendant care, having a lack of privacy, and a difficulty asserting their needs. As anticipated, the researchers doing this work actually, I thought had very good intentions of improving the quality of life of people with disabilities. They do tend to frame disability more from a medical model perspective, but I think this is from the perspective of trying to justify the research and also find funding opportunities and ways to disseminate the technology to people.
Stella, you've got about 3 minutes.
Okay.
That's okay.
This is my last slide anyway. So, though this was an initial exploratory study, you can already see the policy implications for this kind of work, particularly with respect to access, at least in North America. This device here is I think it's called the Jacko arm or the Yakko arm, and it was designed out of Montreal by a company called Robotnik. Though it's not a BMI, it's an example of an access technology that's currently available on the market at $33,000 US. Now, I myself was interested in this device, and I was told that I should be living in Denmark or Sweden because these are made available to people here. They're not made available by our governments. So it's interesting that, these types of technologies already exist in many ways, but they're not really being made available. So I think the way that we legitimize, that we describe disability, that we explain what technologies are needed to mediate between the individual and the environment, really has an impact on legitimizing funding models and ethical models for these types of devices. And that's really just the last thing I wanted to comment on, just something to think about is, how we can understand disability, but also how we can legitimize the technologies that are supposed to be in place to improve quality of life. Well, that's it. And if anybody would like to contact me for more information about my research, then those are my social media links. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I just had a look at the abstract for this paper for the first time since I sent it in, and the content is slightly different from what it said there, but the title is the same, and the spirit of the thing is definitely the same. But it's perhaps a bit less technical and a bit more introductory than it sounds in the handout, which I think is probably a good thing, since what I'm doing is, from a disciplinary point of view, pretty different from most of the other things that have been going on at this conference, but I do think there are connections. So, my field is literature, literature and philosophy in various ways, but in particular literature and moral philosophy, and recently I've been particularly interested in numbers and quantification, and hence the relevance to this conference. And try to keep track of my own time as we go along. Should be possible. Now, this is a book in progress on literature, ethics, and quantification, and the impulse for it goes back a long way in my work and experience of the world, and it has to do, I think, particularly with seeing numbers used in political contexts and in the media and so on in relation to spectacular and often very bad things happening in the world. The project has to do with the quantification of good things as well, but most of the work I've done so far is to do with bad things, with catastrophe and suffering. So, every day when we open the newspaper or look at the news online, of course, we see that things have happened. Disasters, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, whatever it might be, and we're given figures. We're told that a certain number of people have been involved in this event, and sometimes after a while the figures will change, as happened with the attacks in London a few days ago, for example. First it was 6 people have been killed, and then 7, and then 8. These numbers are deployed, they're put out there in the media as though they're significant. And if you have a look at the news, you'll see that there are a lot of these numbers out there of all different sizes. And so we're told that a given event has affected or may affect, for instance, 1 person, 9 people, 207, 3,000, 1 million, etc. And unfortunately, there are new examples every day. And we all, I'm sure, have our own experiences of seeing these numbers and reacting to them. I have my own experiences when I see that something's happened in the news and that 5 people were killed, for instance. That feels differently than hearing that 500 people have been killed. So I'm sure we all have similar reactions. And yet it is difficult to kind of make sense of that in any kind of coherent, rational way. And I say that we try to respond coherently, in inverted commas. Of course, we're all different. But the kinds of reports that we see in the news and in political speeches and so forth that refer to these numbers seem to be implying that there is an audience, us, the audience, who will be interested in these numbers and will somehow know what to do with them. So we, in that sense, try to respond coherently with feeling, but also with justice based on these numbers and the comparisons that we make between them. We try to take the measure of events. So it's kind of measuring going on there, which is related to various kinds of measuring we've had already in this conference, I think. Now, there are all sorts of obvious ways in which, fairly obvious ways in which these numbers can be messed around with and abused. I was at a conference on literary journalism just a few weeks ago, and a journalist from Portugal told me that she had been trained to always refer to 500,000 rather than 500,000, for example, in a report, because 500,000 apparently sounds a bigger number to most people. Actually, I'm not sure that it does to me, but then I've been working with numbers, and so my perceptions and thoughts about this are probably a bit skewed. But journalists are conscious of these things. And as these people, Andreas and Greenhill, that you see here quoted, argue, they're open to manipulation in political contexts. Numbers are acquainted with science. They provide a tempting and powerful political tool. The legitimacy of quantification is based on lofty claims about scientific measures and objective data, however dubious such claims may be. One might make comparisons between things we were hearing earlier today about the way quantification is used in the context of university administration as well. Parallel kind of case. Supposedly scientific measures. For the media and the broader public, this too often means accepting and regurgitating the claims rather than questioning and challenging them. However, a lot of questioning does go on, a lot of questioning and challenging. After 9/11, for example, there were these figures out there. First of all, the numbers of estimated deaths were considerably greater than they actually were, but then we were left with a figure of about 3,000. And obviously that's a huge and appalling number of casualties. But all sorts of public intellectuals and also less famous and prominent people pointed out that these numbers could mean very different things according to the context that you put them in. So people like Chomsky and Butler and Singer and Zizek, and as I say, all sorts of less famous people also made these points. And that is part of an ongoing discussion in kind of political, philosophical circles about the way numbers are used, and the way in which the numbers of people who've been injured or killed in a terrorist attack, for example, are not coherently correlated with the numbers that might be lost due to gun crime, for example, or any of those other things that you see mentioned there, or many other things that can happen to people. And you can also relate this kind of issue to debates that have gone on in relation to all sorts of specific incidents and conflicts in recent years. So, for instance, going back to the war in Iraq, at the beginning of the millennium, there was a long series of articles in important journals such as The Lancet and Philosophy and Public Affairs, debating, and also Nature, I think, actually, debating the statistics of deaths of civilians in the war in Iraq. And all sorts of different methodologies were tried out, and these produced different figures of 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, etc. Widely divergent figures. And so you can see that there is a sort of scientific discourse, a scientific field connected with trying to come up with methodologies that will give us the right numbers of the people who have suffered in a particular disaster or a particular context. But there are all kinds of ways in which that could be complicated further. For instance, all of those articles were to do with civilian casualties in the war in Iraq, but why make that distinction? Because actually, if you look at the soldiers who were fighting for Saddam Hussein, for example, they may not have been civilians, they were soldiers, but they didn't have any alternative. A lot of them, they probably would have been killed if they hadn't agreed to fight. So in a moral sense, how are they somehow less to be worried about than civilian casualties are? So there are all kinds of ways you could complicate that, and I'm sure probably you're thinking of other instances of things that you've heard about in the news where one individual, a certain number of individuals and so forth have been mentioned, and you seem to have been invited to think about that in a certain way. So another paradox that other people have commented about, or another sort of strange situation and disturbing situation, is the amount of attention that the boy who was washed up on the beach in Italy from the migrant boat, the amount of attention that that image and that particular death got compared to whole boatloads that were sinking on a weekly basis. So what can we do with all of this? Because this problem goes on and on and on, this set of issues, and how are we as conscientious, kind of feeling, ethical people supposed to respond and divide up and assign our concern justly. Now, some of these problems go back a long way. Some of these issues actually go back to the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle and people like that. But numbers came to be used kind of more systematically in relation to moral issues, particularly in the 19th century. I put a picture of Jeremy Bentham there that some of you may know and recognize. I partly put him there because I studied at University College London, and that's where he is. This is, if any of you don't know, he's a philosopher, 18th century, early 19th century philosopher who is strongly associated with utilitarianism, well known for his ideas about the greater good of the greater number, the philosophic calculus, as it's called. How do you calculate how to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number? So a very scientific, very mathematical approach to rights and wrongs. And University College, we have his auto icon, as it's called, his skeleton dressed in his clothes with a wax head on in a box there. And there are various things that I would quite like to say about that, but I'll skip over it and we can come back to it. It is relevant to various issues in this conference. But having studied there, I'm kind of proud of him, and I wanted to put him there. So, but his ideas are very problematical. He and other utilitarians in the 19th century, and also now, current utilitarian style philosophers like somebody like Peter Singer, for example, try to ground moral choice on calculation, try to use numbers coherently in moral contexts, and thereby transcend the intuitive or arbitrary kind of ways in which we might respond to things that happen. Now, you can see an example of this kind of thinking in the work of one of the greatest 19th century utilitarians, Henry Sidgwick, who says that he obtains the self-evident principle that the good of any one individual is of no more importance from the point of view, if I may say so, of the universe than the good of any other. And it is evident to me that as a rational being, I am bound to aim at good generally, so far as that is attainable by my efforts, not merely at a particular part of it. So you can see there the spirit of the utilitarian project. He's going to be rational, and he's going to treat everybody as a unit in a kind of mathematical, arithmetical sense, and he's going to work out what matters on that basis. Later philosophers like Bernard Williams, the 20th century philosopher, have come along, for example, and pointed out that there are problems with this. Williams says, Sidgwick believes he's following practical rationality, but what is in question is an ethical principle. Sidgwick talks about the point of view of the universe, but there's no such thing, and you could say actually that what we've got here is a sort of post-Christian Victorian point of view. People would have been thinking about the point of view of God, and now that has been sort of secularized, but it's still suggesting that the universe kind of cares in a way, which it doesn't, other people would say. So it's an ethical principle, though Sidgwick doesn't seem to realize that. Moreover, utilitarianism needs another principle as well, that there are no other basic ethical considerations besides that first one. This too is an ethical intuition. So people have come along and said that these calculating approaches to ethics they don't get away from the intuitive. And I claim that there are further intuitions involved, perhaps even more fundamental. We intuit or assume that bad things get worse according to a simple arithmetical logic. So if something bad happens to two people, then that's twice as bad as it happening to one person. And that we have a comprehensive model of the context for these bad things, the whole world of human experience that underwrites the value of the results that this logic produces. So it's all one coherent mathematical system. We assume that. But then, if you put that in the context of our experience of the world, well, here now in the present, a mind-boggling range of very bad things are happening. And how do we take account of all of those things? In the past, there have been more bad things that happened than we will ever know. Just the other day, in Morocco, they found out that the race Homo sapiens is 100,000 years older than we thought, right? 200,000, 300,000, what difference does it make? Well, that's 100,000 years more of human experience, human good things, human bad things, which we will never know about in detail. And that's just humans, and you could say, well, what about the other hominids and other animals, for that matter? And then in the future, who knows? Unfortunately, hopefully, lots more good things are going to happen in the future, but obviously lots of bad things as well. So we're never going to be able to take account of all of that. So that means if our moral concerns were arithmetically, 2 things bad, worse than 1, 3 things bad, worse than 2, etc., then the individual case is going to be infinitesimally small because it's part of an infinite sequence. And then you can turn that around and say, oh, well, the solution to that is to say that the individual case of something terrible happening to somebody is infinitely bad. That's the worst that could ever happen. When something terrible has happened to somebody, the worst for humanity, in a sense, has already happened. But then that also means that further events are going to be meaningless. So it's a double bind, it's a paradox, which seems to me to make any kind of moral thinking actually rather difficult. And that might seem counterintuitive or ridiculous, but one of the main things I maintain is that people are more affected by that kind of philosophical doubt or paradox than they realize. I will be wrapping up fairly soon. This is really the main, the last slide with text on it. My attempt to contribute to this discussion has to do with literature, and I argue that scientific, statistical, rational, and utilitarian philosophical approaches to these kind of issues are inadequate, that we need to look at or take into account of other discourses that are more flexible, that contain irony and paradox and contradiction and so forth. And that is where the literary comes in and becomes intimately entangled with the ethical. Now, so that's the main point, and that's why I'm working on literature and ethics and numbers, and arguing that literature is so important in relation to these very, very pressing and disturbing issues that crop up every day. So, to conclude, I've given you this handout with 3 short literary texts, because I thought that would actually be the best way of showing what I'm trying to get at, really, showing 3 different writers using numbers in ways that are interesting and philosophically provocative. 3 thoughtful characters, as you see there. But also slightly humorous, I think. I don't know whether Wordsworth there in the corner is actually smiling, but the other 2 certainly are. Anyway, and you've got 3 texts there on the handout that are all to do with very, very serious issues, but all do have a touch of humour attached to them as well. Tony Harrison, still alive, I think. I think he turns 80 this year. Very interesting Northern English poet in all kinds of ways. Of immediate relevance, I think he's the most significant war poet in English since the Second World War. And the little extract you've got there is from a poem that he wrote in response to the Gulf War, beginning of the 1990s. It was first published in The Guardian. It's a longer poem. This is just an extract of it. And the poem accompanied a photograph of an Iraqi soldier who had burned to death in the cab of his truck. So incredibly disturbing picture. But Harrison does the incredibly bold thing in his poem of actually imagining that person as the speaker of the poem, this dead Iraqi soldier, and even allowing him to make jokes and so forth. So it's verging on the edge of very bad taste, but in fact, I think most people found it very powerful, political, and moving. And it makes some interesting points about numbers. So it's called A Cold Coming, which is a reference to a poem by T.S. Eliot about the coming of the three kings to Bethlehem. So that's the three wise men at the beginning. But it's also a reference to coming in the sense of ejaculation and cold in the sense of frozen in liquid nitrogen, because it's referring to this dead Iraqi soldier, but it's also referring to some American soldiers who apparently had frozen their sperm before setting off to Iraq as a precaution. And Harrison imagines the dead Iraqi soldier talking about that. I read the news of three wise men who left their sperm in nitrogen. 3 foes of ours, 3 wise Marines with sample flasks and magazines, 3 wise soldiers from Seattle who banked their sperm before the battle. Did number 1 say, God be thanked, I've got my precious semen banked? And number 2, oh, praise the Lord, my last best shot is safely stored. And number 3, praise be to God, I left my wife, my frozen wad. So, if their fate was to be gassed, at least they thought their name would last. Harrison's from northern England, so that rhymes. Anyway. And though cold corpses in Kuwait, they could by proxy procreate. Excuse a skull, half roast, half bone, for using such a scornful term. It may seem out of all proportion, but I wish I'd taken their precaution. I'll leave it there. You can read the rest of the extract. You see that Harrison then goes on to look at numbers, and in the poem as a whole, it's to do with how difficult it is to talk about such terrible things in a coherent statistical way, but it's also about the tremendous disproportion in the resources and experience between the Iraqi soldiers and the American ones, and so on. So I'll just move on quickly. The next example there is from a 19th century novel. There's George Eliot, who was Marion Evans in real life, and it's from Middlemarch, a novel which is about lots of people, but which still has a few people who are put in special focus. And this passage, which in a way exemplifies Victorian doubt and seriousness, kind of stereotypes that we have about the Victorians, is perhaps the most interesting text in the whole literature from my point of view. And in it, George Eliot's narrator describes a particular character, Dorothea, who has just got married to somebody much older than herself and has been disappointed, found that this was a bad choice, and she describes this character's disappointment. Nor can I suppose that when Mrs. Casaubon is discovered in a fit of weeping 6 weeks after her wedding, the situation will be regarded as tragic. Some discouragement, some faintness of heart at the new, real future which replaces the imaginary is not unusual, and we do not expect people to be deeply moved by what is not unusual. That element of tragedy which lies in the very fact of frequency has not yet wrought itself into the coarse emotion of mankind, and perhaps our frames could hardly bear much of it. If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heartbeat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. As it is, the quickest of us walk about well wadded with stupidity. So she's saying basically that the scale of suffering in the world is so vast that we couldn't possibly get to grips with it. And she's talking about human suffering, but through those metaphors, actually, she's implying that we could even extend it to animals and even plants. So it's an enormous can of worms which we'll never get to grips with. The last example is from William Wordsworth, so slightly earlier figure. This is a poem from the end of the 18th century, called We Are Seven, so you've got a number in the title. And Eliot's quotation ends with this idea of being well wadded with stupidity. And that sounds like a sort of damning thing to say about human beings, or for her to say about herself. And this is the most sort of notoriously intellectual novelist of the Victorian period, talking about being stupid. But I would suggest that what she's drawing attention to there is a sort of inevitable aspect of what it is to be human and to be faced with ethical situations which are kind of irresolvable, ultimately, that can't be just mathematically calculated. So to recognize that stupidity is actually to be smart. Wordsworth's poem is also kind of about stupidity, you could say. A simple child, dear brother Jim, that lightly draws its breath and feels its life in every limb, what should it know of death? I met a little cottage girl. She was 8 years old, she said. Her hair was thick with many a curl that clustered round her head. She had a rustic woodland air, and she was wildly clad. Her eyes were fair and very fair. Her beauty made me glad. Sisters and brothers, little maid, how many may you be? How many? 7 in all, she said, and wondering looked at me. And where are they, I pray you tell? She answered, 7 are we, and 2 of us at Conway dwell, and 2 are gone to sea. 2 of us in the churchyard lie, my sister and my brother, and in the churchyard cottage I dwell near them with my mother. You say that 2 at Conway dwell, and 2 are gone to sea, yet you are 7. I pray you tell, sweet maid, how this may be. Then did the little maid reply, 7 boys and girls are we, 2 of us in the churchyard lie, beneath the churchyard tree. You run about, my little maid, your limbs they are alive. If 2 are in the churchyard laid, then ye are only 5. Their graves are green, they may be seen, the little maid replied. 12 steps or more from my mother's door, and they are side by side. My stockings there I often knit, my kerchief there I hem, and there upon the ground I sit and sing to them. And often after sunset, sir, when it is light and fair, I take my little porringer and eat my supper there. The first that died was little Jane. In bed she moaning lay, till God released her of her pain, and then she went away. So in the churchyard she was laid, and all the summer dry, together round her grave we played, my brother John and I. And when the ground was white with snow, and I could run and slide, my brother John was forced to go, and he lies by her side. How many are you then, said I, if they 2 are in heaven? The little maid did reply, O master, we are 7. But they are dead, these 2 are dead, their spirits are in heaven. 'Twas throwing words away, for still the little maid would have her will, and said, Nay, we are 7. So, somebody's being stupid there, you could say, the little girl, or the older man who's talking to her. But the poem is not stupid. It could seem a bit sentimental in a way, but it's like the passage from George Eliot, and also the poem from Tony Harrison in a way. It's talking about suffering and numbers and how difficult it is to bring them together in a coherent way. So those are just some examples of the way literature can do the kinds of things I'm looking at. And I'll stop there. I hope I haven't gone over too much.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be the very last presenter of that very amazing conference, and thanks for all of you for still being with us. So Dominic has already introduced myself and the co-authors of this talk and paper. You have already heard our individual projects. So Eric and myself, we work on a project on taxonomies of the self. Agnieszka is involved and focuses on human enhancement. So from our individual and joint readings, we wanted to do something together on self-tracking. And as Hartmut Rosa is quite famous in German as a sociologist, and moreover he has just published a book, somehow we joined our interests on self-tracking, optimization, autonomy and alienation, and we decided to go for this joint venture project, which is still a work in progress, which we present here. So listening and discussing with you for the last 3 days, it became quite obvious that new ways of looking at self-tracking are required to open up our minds. And that was our starting point. Hence, we, as most of you and us, we were looking for an alternative way. And we found in Hartmut Rosa's recent book, Resonance, an elaborated theoretical concept to work with, as it proposes a shift of perspectives, criticizing the sociological focus on resources. And surprisingly to me and my colleagues, Hartmut Rosa's understanding of modern society as an accelerated society has already been introduced by Martin Berg, who had already to leave, unfortunately, as a frame for understanding self-tracking. So it's not a new idea, which I introduce now in this very last paper. So as the book, unfortunately, hasn't been yet published in English, I will emphasize some specific terms of it, but I can only give a very brief overview, as the original book has more than 800 pages. And as I learned yesterday from Martin Berg, it will be soon published by Polity Press. But I also learned that Hartmut Rosa's book, when they get translated, get sometimes shortened and then end up with 100 and 200 pages. So there's some, I think they skip out all the novels and poems and opera examples he puts in the German novels. So I imagine that there are the points. So Rosa, in his book Resonance, drafts a sociology of good life based on his previous work on acceleration. He proposes a sociology of world relations, a phenomenologically grounded relational sociology, which focuses on the relations between subject and world, both constituted through this specific process. World is understood as everything which can come across a subject. The world constitutes the horizon where events take place and things are located. Such forms of world relation depend on collective circumstances as they are formed in practices and institutions, and they are deeply rooted in the thinking and doings of individuals. Following Rosa, world relations are alienated when, now a quote, subject and world face each other indifferently or as enemies, repulsively, and hence internally unrelated. Alienation defines a condition in which the adaptation of the world fails, so that the world seems to be cold, rigid, repellent, and non-responsive. End of the quote. In contrast, Rosa develops the concept of resonance based on its physical meaning and as a form of relation of the world between two discrete entities, which is constituted by affect and emotion, intrinsic interest and self-efficacy expectation. Such entities respond to each other. As a relational concept, resonance describes a relation in which two elements touch each other through a medium or space of resonance, and these two elements respond to each other, keeping their own voice. So resonance is not an echo, but a response relation. And this kind of response is only possible where strong valuations get touched. Strong values tell what has the value to be pursued or tracked, following intrinsic interests. Further resonance requires a self-efficacy expectation, as without this expectation nobody can really expect to really touch or transform anything. Further resonance implies a moment of unavailability, which means that you allow the world to surprise you, to be open to the world somehow. Last but not least, the world affects you, or in other words, you get affected by the world, and you have emotions which modulate the relation. These are the main categories which Rosa mentions and describes as relevant for determining if a relation is rather prone towards alienation or resonance. Hence, we will use these categories for our empirical study, but before that, I would like to shortly expand on Rosa's view on self-tracking, because he mentioned that explicitly in his book. Rosa sees self-tracking as an example for a modern tendency that the human life appears to be optimizable and quantifiable in every aspect. It suggests that the quality of life can be measured, but that it tries to measure is nothing other than the resource potential of the individuals. In this, Rosa sees a radical cultural shift in that what should ensure chances for a good life is now not only confound with the good life itself, rather it has to bind lifestyle energies and strategies because of structural imperatives of acceleration. He understands the modernity project as an intent to increase one's range, and in this sense also one's autonomy. Hence, Rosa understands both the increase of autonomy as well as a moment of submission tendentially as alienation, as he understands increasing one's range as a cold and controlled relation with the world. This is one of these shifts of perspective, as he does not simply substitute the concept of autonomy through his concept of resonance. One of the main points of criticism to his work is the lack of empirical data and his purely theoretical elaboration of ideas. This might be also one of the reasons why Rosa associates self-tracking directly with alienation, developing this rather ideal type view and category. Hence, Rosa defines self-tracking as clearly alienating practice, which, according to him, should be rather avoided. But at the same time, Rosa does not work, but as Rosa does not work with empirical data, he also states, and I quote, "Empirically, nearly all forms of bodily world relations are hybrid forms, which contain all possible overlaps and diverse interactions between mute and resonant moments." End of quote. Consequently, self and bodily experiences, what we have been looking at for the last 3 days, can never be completely resonant or completely mute. Following Rosa, the task of a sociology of world relations is to describe the existential, contextual, institutional, and situational differences in their specific weighting in each moment. And that's what we want to do. And for that, we use the data we collected in our individual projects and make a secondary analysis of these interviews and observations. In total, we used 15 interviews and observations with different kind of self-trackers. And therefore, for this analysis, we have developed this graph you see here. As we've already learned, Rosa defines resonance as a specific manner to establish a relation between the self and the world. Hence, the self gets in touch with the world in our graph on the y-axis, and the world gets in touch with the self, the x-axis. In this graph, the categories of strong values and intrinsic interests are not depicted, as they function as a condition which has to be present in a certain degree, and they work in the background of this graph. Here on the x-axis, we describe the categories which affect the self, as well as the unavailability of the world. And then the self reaches out towards the world, more or less emotionally, and these emotions, we depict them on the y-axis. And the self has also more or less self-efficacy expectation, which is also then depicted on the y-axis. But let's stop looking at this theoretical graph and let's go directly to the empirical examples, which then will show what we mean with all that. So our case 1 is close to Rosa's understanding of self-tracking. It is project or goal-driven self-tracking. High intrinsic motivation and a strong valuation are defined by the goal of the self-tracker. In the case you can see on the slides, we have an athlete who aims to run an Ironman under 10 hours. Actually, he's going to has another intent this Sunday. The affect dimension is rather unresponsive, as self-tracking aids as an instrumental framework to achieve his goal, whereas self-efficacy expectation is high and the unavailability of the world is ideally none in his case. As an example, this athlete follows the advice of his self-tracking devices quite blindly. In an interview, he tells us that even if he feels very ill and the device tells him to go out for a long and intensive training session, he follows the advice, and after a couple of kilometers, he feels that it works. Quote, "The body is there, but the mind tells you something different." End of quote. We all know these rather prototype cases, the athletes, the project guided and employees who are really planning, measuring and controlling their own or external definition of ambitious goals. Our case 2 is not foreseen by Rosa, but a couple of examples show up in our empirical material. We call them the playful self-tracking. Let's become more familiar with Conrad, a prototype of a playful self-tracker. His intrinsic motivation is to be flexible. Therefore, he plays with gadget, numbers, and his self-tracking practices. Let's read and listen to his words. "Really, as I've got a scale which analyzes body fat and weight, and every day I use the scale, this is registered. That's why I do not use it on Mondays. That is too shocking. Because you have just passed the weekend, and that causes such a peak, which is not realistic. But on Tuesday I exercise, I had a reasonable Monday, and on Wednesday morning I can reuse my scale without further concerns. Everything is normal again." Well, he avoids bad results by adjusting the times he steps on the scale. In other parts of the interview, he not plays with the times he uses the self-tracking devices, but he explains how he plays around with measurements and conventions. So he compares the BMI with kilograms, with belly fat, and so on. He sees his tracking as an experiment, and to some degree the apps are black boxes. So there's always something unexpected coming out of that, to which he and all the other playful self-trackers then react. The third case is one which is quite often forgotten. It's the failing self-tracking. And here we come back to our previous example, Conrad. He measures, as we have seen, his weight constantly, but he failed to measure his sleep. A little bit according to what yesterday was explained by Mina. He had a period in which he slept rather badly, and hence there was some intrinsic motivation to improve his sleeping habit. But the measurements and the numbers did simply confirm his bodily feelings, and the graphs did not really tell him anything new. That's why his self-efficacy expectation was quite high in the beginning, but then he became disappointed by sleep tracking, as he did not understand at all what the numbers tried to tell him. The tracking did not provide any added value. So self-efficacy disappeared, and the world, translated and mediated through these numbers, did not really touch him and the self. And here we can see that the single self-tracker can combine different practices, so he can embody somehow different ways of resonant or mute self-tracking practices. In another failing case, the self-tracking gives even wrong results and advices, so that, for example, one interviewee, Bettina, she eats even too much because the advice always tells her that she is in a deficit of calories, but it makes her really feel uncomfortable, and then even negative effect is produced in the whole way of self-tracking. Well, now to come to the last case, the fourth one. In the beginning we thought that that's it, that the fourth case is described by Rosa as oases of resonance, and these are characterized by the lack of the self to reach out and to generate resonance on its own. They're only touched by the world, and the self is reduced to the experiences without being able or willing to fulfill the self-efficiency. For Rosa, these are concerts you go to, football matches you go to, where you simply consume the experience without really being part as a very active member, where you are also able to transform things. And as in self-tracking, one of the main goals is to do something and to transform something, probably. We in the beginning assumed that we wouldn't find any empirical cases for this box. But then we found an example. It is surprisingly also an athlete, but he doesn't go for a specific goal. He just looks for transparency or visibility through registering his runs and other physical activities. In this sense, he uses self-tracking as a digital diary without wanting to change anything. Hence, self-tracking becomes here a practice of perception. And then we come already to the conclusions. Focusing on self-tracking practices and relations, a new classification of self-tracking users has shown up, using Rosa's concept of resonance. There were things which were rather unexpected, as we, for example, didn't expect to find oases of resonance in self-tracking. And what does it really mean, this shift towards a sociology of world relations? How could we interpret that? Well, first, new categories gain weight: intrinsic motivation, self-efficacy and self-efficacy expectation, affect, emotion, and unavailability. These might, for example, help to understand the failing and non-successful tracking based on the unresponsiveness and the unavailability of the gadget, as well as of the world, which is then translated through the gadget and the numbers. And here we come back to the title of the session, Ethics. As most of you will know, Rosa follows a rather normative view of the world. By using resonance and the central categories we extracted from his concept, we think we were able to enrich and diversify Rosa's rather simplistic view of self-tracking, and also to somehow nuance this rather normative view of the world. And this might give some hints regarding the development and design of new self-tracking tools. So, for example, how to avoid case 2, the failing self-tracking. And then, as we've seen in some cases, the unavailability of the tools modulates the possibility to get affected by them. But at the same time, for some intrinsic interests, as for example, sports, this unavailability is really not even wanted. So really this would make absolutely no difference to modulate that. So this new classification, at least to our feeling, really seems to help to differentiate self-tracking practices in more detail. That's at least what we learned so far from the readings and practices we analyzed with Rosa's concept, and we will be delighted to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
So maybe just a short question to Stella, because I'm also about in this self-enhancement topic, and just a really short question. How do you differentiate between transhuman and cyborg?
Well, I think in some respects we are already at the point of being cyborgs, right? So any technology that humans have constructed to augment their physiology already renders us cyborgs. But from a science fiction perspective, I think there's always been this question of at what point does the cyborg cease, at what point is a cyborg less human and more machine? So at what point do we lose our humanity, and what does it really mean for the future of humanity to fully merge the technological with the physiological? And I think the problem is that ethicists have not been able to adequately address this question. So they haven't addressed this question in time to catch up to the technologies that are being created. Yeah.
Thank you.
So for Carolyn, I really enjoyed the presentation, and obviously I haven't read Rosa's book because I can't read German. But I was really interested in your take on it, and I just want to kind of clarify a couple of things. So, were you suggesting that we could use this notion of resonance to see ways in which to kind of overcome that alienation from self-tracking, or the potential alienation that he would see? Or is it just a kind of a conceptualization? And if you are seeing that as a kind of a potential way of seeing a resonance between people and data or the tracking themselves, does that require? Is that possible? If again, I don't totally understand the concept of resonance as he's using it, but in the kind of the more standard way, it seems a kind of. It's using terms of sound reflecting off things or two things vibrating together. So actually, is touch important in that? So data is something we can't really touch, but the objects that we use to produce the data we might touch in terms of the devices and things like this. So is touch an important part of that in order to being actually to resonate with it, I suppose.
Thank you. I'll start with the last one. it depends all in which sense it affects the self, and as the self gets affected, so touch can affect for sure, but we know also that pure numbers affect a lot. I mean, we've seen that with the poems and what you've explained, and there's no touch in numbers. Although you have now the screens where you touch numbers and so on. So these things change and before you've written numbers. But I mean, it is important, these bodily really reactions and sensations are important, but at the same time, numbers also have clear effects. And you see that in the case of Conrad, where he don't really likes the curve going up, so he doesn't want to see the number on Monday and Tuesday, so he cheats on his numbers. No, so he really gets affected and somehow touched by these for him wrong numbers. And then in which sense overcoming or not alienation? No, I think Rosa would simply put self-tracking into one box, or in the left up box, saying, well, it's always alienating practices, and we would say no, it's not always alienating. And one example which I haven't really put here because it's a little bit more tricky and more complicated is people are motivated by chronic diseases and then doing self-tracking, because you always have to ask where people come from. The problem with Rosa is somehow that he always starts from the ideal point of view, that there somehow is no alienation. But I mean, when you're already alienated from your body because you're chronically ill or something else, then, for example, self-tracking can really help to overstep one kind of alienation. And we have the example of a musician who works a lot with resonance and really talks about that, but he is physically ill and he uses self-tracking to get in touch with the world in order to re-get in touch with his body, which doesn't really respond as he expected to do that. So there are lots of different shapes in between. And there also the tricky thing is that really Rosa doesn't understand autonomy and alienation as normally it's understood, and he doesn't link resonance the same way as he puts, well, for him, moments of autonomy are also very close to alienation and alienating practices. So there are a couple of tricky things in his theoretical approach, but our approach is not to overcome alienation. And even Rosa says it's not really the goal to eliminate it. It's simply to be more conscious about it. And then comes his normative part on the mountains where you should go walking, and which then resonate with you. And well, that's then where we should start criticizing his approach. Yeah.
Okay. I'll take it from you anyway. For me, your presentations, all three of them, raised questions that we need to confront the ethical framework of our humanity, because going forward we will have to answer questions about, what it is that we want to preserve and what it is we want to let go. There are technologies right now who work towards migrating the human brain to machines, so you can prolong or you can transform and transcend death. That's the idea. And I don't think we have tackled, definitely not with apps that count steps, the ethical framework of how far we want to get it before we lose who we are. And I don't know whether you have thoughts about that.
All of us
A small question to close the session.
all of us were talking about frameworks of humanity, in a sense, I think. Just listening to the other two presentations, I was seeing connections that I hadn't necessarily expected. For instance, the idea of the cyborg, literature, a literary text, the work of art that somebody produces is a kind of prosthetic enhancement of themselves. Which is sort of reconstructing the framework of one's own humanity. And then self-tracking, which you were talking about and that has been talked about so much in this conference. That's also a sort of framework of enhancing and maximizing the self. You were just talking about self-tracking and chronic illness. I think that lots of kinds of self-tracking that you were talking about and that other people have been talking about is to do with chronic illness in the sense of mortality, actually. It's to do with trying to manage our own lives to get the most out of them, make them last as long as possible, to use the time as efficiently as possible. And that in turn relates to something that people can do by writing, by producing art, for example, by producing literature, because you can make things of yourself by writing that you can't otherwise achieve in your life, and that somehow relates to the efforts that are also going on in the kind of literary and philosophical thinking that I'm thinking about in order to take account of everything that's going on in the world. And I could also bring in Jeremy Bentham in his glass box in the picture into this, because there's somebody who kind of tried to track and maximize the world, everything that was going on in the world around him through measurement and calculation. And then he does that in his own life and with his own body in the end, leaving himself as a sort of functional artwork to sit there in university college, so that even after life he's making absolutely the most of himself in a strange way that is kind of related to self-tracking and also to a kind of idea of the cyborg, perhaps in some ways. So, cluster of odd thoughts, but all to do with frameworks of the human in a way, I think, and seeing connections with the other papers.
Yeah, and also when you were speaking about the quantification and statistics and things like that, I was thinking about resource management and how, we're talking about the ethics of all of this and the ethics of humanity, but really what it may boil down to in the end is really numbers. So if we're able to transfer our consciousness someday into a computer, it's going to be a question of who can afford to transfer their consciousness into a computer. That won't be available to everybody. Whose consciousness is worthwhile to transfer it to computers? So it's an evaluation, and I think the same thing is going to happen with BMIs. It's going to be a question of, if we give somebody this technology, what are we saving as government? So it's going to be, how much is this individual already utilizing in attendant care services and other technologies that we can replace by giving them, a BMI? And that's kind of a sad thought to me, that in the end it may all boil down to numbers.
And there are also constant borders. I mean, the athlete, when he did a QS talk, he mentioned all these different measurements and gadgets he uses. And then towards the very end, he says, well, and by the way, I also do regular blood analysis, but it seems that nobody talks here about that because it's more invasive. So he takes his own blood and sends it to a laboratory. So that was the first step from seeing, the self-trackers here, they talk about gadgets and sensors on the skin, but not going into the body. And then when we talk to the bodybuilders, the ones not taking drugs, they are permanently also putting this line between, we have to do all that with the calories deficit and so on, because we don't want to have to take drugs as these other bodybuilders. So there's also this permanent discourse on enhancement and using drugs, not using drugs, what is legitimate, what is not legitimate, making fun of the others. It's a constant in nearly all the self-tracking interviews we do in very different fields. So I think this ethics boundary of being more invasive, biohacking enhancement, it's there, although it's not really pronounced as an ethics issue very often.
Any more questions, please? Okay.
This is just really general. What kind of ethics are we talking about? It's actually not that clear. Like, are we talking about interpersonal ethics, or are we talking about maybe like human interspecies ethics, or like human global ecosystem? Debate.
Well, we first of all refer to humans. So there are also different ethics cultures. So in Germany, you don't have ethics committees at universities. So you have another approach to justifying your research or so on than in the UK context, for example. So you approach things a little bit differently. I mean, they're the norm. Well, for research, they're normal code of ethics towards. Well, I mean, the names I've used are not the real names, although, well, you can refine them, some of them quite easily. But then talking with them, in some interviews at least, they refer to really wider ethics. And with one bodybuilder, actually, we were discussing issues of war and how bodybuilding came out of a kind of military thinking of training the body. So sometimes you really get the big macro framework of things, but not in all interviews, let's say, where it stays more on the everyday ethics of being able to do things. It's out there or it's not out there. So you're really confronted with more or less all levels, at least in the empirical fieldwork.
Yeah, in my case, well, I'm talking about the ethics of how we relate to the suffering around us, and how the ethical questions as to how we decide which individuals around us require our attention. So you asked whether it was sort of interspecies ethics, and that's something that I just touched on very, very briefly. But that is a big question, which is becoming more and more understood, I think, by moral philosophers, or some of them at the moment, realizing that a lot of the things that have been done in moral philosophy in the past have been based on a baseless assumption that human beings are qualitatively different from all other creatures. So that's one aspect of it. But more specifically, I guess today I was looking at a certain kind of ethical tradition to do with quantifying utilitarianism, using numbers to make moral decisions, and pointing out that there are all sorts of problems with that. And so I guess advocating a more kind of intuitive, or at least flexible type of ethics. Though, I mean, that's not really my job, I think, to advocate a particular moral system. I'm more interested in through literature, drawing attention to paradoxes and contradictions between the systems that people try to use.
I think that in my case, the ethics has two components. So one is, what value do we give to different life experiences? So if we value a lived experience from the perspective of somebody with a disability, why would we want to bring that individual's experience closer to a normative experience of humanity? But the second question is, if we determine that a technology is valuable to improving or enhancing somebody's quality of life, if we determine that the technology has a greater, that kind of greater value, then how do we make a judgment as to who receives the technology, how the technology is disseminated, how it's funded? So in order to make those decisions, we first have to show that it is valuable and it is in some ways necessary. And that's why there's this tension between the medical and the social. and it needs to straddle those hemispheres in order to be available to people. Yeah, absolutely. But typically, traditionally, medical interventions have been, we as societies have more readily funded medical interventions than social interventions. And that's especially true in, I would say, the Western world, so in Canada and the United States.
Okay, great. So probably there are no more questions, or if there is any last one question, anyone? Okay, well, another round of applause for our panel.